You smell it before you hear it. Not the iron, not the torch smoke. It is the sour tang of sweat steeped in stone, layered with centuries of fear. The air beneath the palace floors carries a damp chill, one that clings to your throat as you descend further. You touch the wall and feel it, moisture from the earth itself, blackened by soot from fires long extinguished. But it is not the walls you remember. It is the silence, a silence carved into every corner, as though sound itself had been executed here. You are standing inside the royal torture chambers. Here, in these vaults hidden beneath castles and palaces across Europe, voices were torn from throats only to vanish into walls too thick for the world above to hear. The cries did not rise to the courts, nor to the streets. They stayed here, sinking into stone and dripping down with the water that still seeps from the ceiling. This is not myth, it is recorded. The Tower of London kept its dungeons. The Spanish Inquisition maintained its secret rooms, where devices such as the strappado pulled shoulders from their sockets. In Prague, within the dungeons beneath the old town hall, municipal records note the racks, the cages, the iron collars where prisoners gasped until their last breath. In the Habsburg courts of Vienna, chambers were fitted with hooks and rings still visible centuries later. Each kingdom, each court, ensured that its grip on power was sealed not only with crown and seal, but with fear. The year is 1252, when Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull ad extirpanda, sanctioning the use of torture by inquisitors. What had been whispered practices became legalized instruments of judgment. From that moment forward, screams gained legitimacy, but they still remained confined to the chambers. You feel the weight of that decree pressing down as though the chains on the walls were meant for you. You see the light now, the dim flicker of a torch reflected on rusted iron. Shackles fixed too low to the ground, forcing bodies into a crouch that became unbearable. Wooden frames where limbs were stretched until sinew tore. The very floor bears the marks of dragged feet. Scraped stone where men and women clawed for balance while their dignity was stripped away. And yet, above ground, the courts spoke of justice, of confession, of truth. Below, in these stone bellies of palaces, the truth was manufactured by pain. To refuse was to be broken. To submit was to be silenced. The chamber allowed no other outcome. The past is not dead. It is only waiting. If what you are about to witness unsettles you, let it linger. Consider subscribing, not for numbers, but to help these buried histories rise again. If you find value, leave a mark, a like. If it stays with you, leave silence. You walk deeper. You ask where these chambers first took root. To answer, you must return to a time when kings believed their rule was ordained by God, when challenges to authority were met not with debate but with chains. By the late medieval era, torture was not an exception but a procedure woven into law. In France, la question referred to judicial torture that judges could order before sentencing. In England, though common law forbade it, the royal prerogative allowed monarchs to bypass legal restrictions. Under the Tudors, the rack was used in the Tower of London despite Parliament never approving it. Records are clear. In 1597, the Jesuit priest John Gerard described in his memoir how he was suspended by manacles for hours. His wrists bleeding, his body collapsing, yet forced to keep silent. In Spain, accounts describe the potro, the rack, where limbs were stretched until bones cracked, all under the gaze of inquisitors who carefully recorded each word forced from the victim's mouth. By the 17th century, torture chambers had become both feared and denied. Monarchs used them in secret, even as Enlightenment thinkers began to condemn the practice. Yet the rooms were never emptied. In Vienna's Hofburg Palace, dungeons beneath the court chamber still housed instruments of coercion. In France, the Bastille carried the echoes of prisoners broken in its bowels. You realize the chambers were not merely rooms. They were instruments of state. Every stone, every device, Every silence built the scaffolding of authority. And the authority lasted because screams were swallowed before they could reach the streets. What remained above was peace, order, obedience. What remained below was agony without record, save for the iron still rusting in place. And tonight, you are here, remembering. You descend further, and the stones seem to tighten around you. It is not merely the weight of architecture, it is centuries of human voices pressed into these walls. Each chamber carries its own date, its own record, its own memory. The first scratch on the parchment of history begins with royal fear. And it is fear that carved these chambers into permanence. By the 13th century, Europe was a landscape of growing kingdoms and fragile crowns. Authority was contested by nobles, rebels, heretics, and anyone who dared whisper against the throne. To maintain order, monarchs required not only soldiers and judges, but rooms where resistance could be erased before it spread. These were not public executions, those came later, in the squares and scaffolds. These were silent punishments, designed to break men in secret so that fear could ripple outward without ever seeing the spark that created it. In England, the Tower of London became more than a fortress, it was a machine of silence. Documents record that during the reign of Edward the first prisoners were lowered into pits so narrow that they could not move. The Little Ease was one such chamber, a cramped stone cell where one could neither stand, sit, nor lie down, limbs twisted, joints burned, and the body gave way to cramp upon cramp until time itself dissolved into torment. No tools were needed beyond the walls themselves, but devices soon followed. By the late 14th century, the rack had become infamous. Witness accounts describe how the condemned were tied hand and foot, their limbs stretched until tendons ruptured. John Holland, Duke of Exeter, oversaw such devices, so much so that the rack in the tower was remembered as the Duke of Exeter's daughter. Chroniclers did not invent the name, it was how contemporaries recognized the instrument of royal power. The sound of bone and tendon snapping never reached the cord above. It stayed here, embedded in the oak and iron that still carried the strain of each turn. Cross the Channel to France, and you find La Question, a judicial torture officially sanctioned to extract confessions. Records from the Parliament of Paris describe the use of water poured down a prisoner's throat until the stomach swelled near to bursting. Bound flat, nostrils pinched, the victim was forced to consume liter after liter of liquid until suffocation blurred with drowning. It was not considered murder, it was considered procedure. The chamber absorbed the gurgling, the retching, the choking gasps. Above, scribes recorded only the words forced between heaves. The agony itself was not deemed worthy of ink. In Spain, the Inquisition etched its mark deepest of all. Beginning in the late 15th century, inquisitors claimed authority not only over bodies but over souls. The strappado became their favored method. Victims had their arms bound behind their backs, then hoisted by ropes attached to pulleys in the ceiling. The sudden suspension wrenched shoulders from their sockets. Contemporary notes from inquisitorial manuals describe it without emotion. The joints are loosed. But life remains. It was deliberate. Pain that destroyed the body yet preserved the breath needed for confession. In some chambers, weights were tied to the ankles, dragging the body further until tendons snapped like cords under strain. As you walk through these remembered vaults, you see how architecture itself was complicit. Narrow corridors prevented witnesses. Iron rings embedded in stone walls reveal where ropes once hissed with each pull. Drainage channels carved into the floor tell of liquids, water, blood, filth, directed away to keep the chamber ready for the next body. These are not romantic exaggerations. Archaeological surveys of medieval dungeons in places like Carcassonne and Nuremberg confirm such structures. The rooms were not improvised, they were engineered. And yet, silence above remained absolute. Monarchs and inquisitors alike denied cruelty. When accounts surfaced, they were dismissed as exaggeration. or silenced through intimidation. But the records persisted, hidden in trial documents and the memoirs of survivors. John Gerard, the Jesuit priest tortured in the Tower in 1597, wrote with detail that cannot be mistaken. He described how the manacles cut into his wrists, suspending his entire weight from bones that threatened to split. For hours he hung, praying silently, until faintness overtook him. His confession was never given, but his testimony survives, preserved in ink against the silence. By the 16th century, these chambers had become symbols not only of royal power but of divine sanction. Torture was cloaked in the language of righteousness. The papal bull ad extirpanda had long justified the use of pain for extracting heresy. And monarchs seized the same authority for treason, rebellion, or dissent. In Portugal, inquisitorial manuals listed approved devices. In Germany, princely courts used the rack, the thumbscrew, and the boot, a device of iron clamps that crushed bones to splinters. Each region maintained its own tradition, but the chambers shared one truth: they erased opposition without the spectacle of the scaffold. You pause at the thought of spectacle, for executions were public theater. Heads rolled before crowds, bodies burned as warnings. But torture was not theater, it was rehearsal. It prepared the condemned to enter public death already broken, already silenced, already erased as a figure of resistance. By the time a prisoner emerged into daylight, they were less a human than an example of submission. The true breaking happened here, beneath stone and torchlight. Imagine the smells: scorched iron from heated pincers, acrid smoke from torches held too close, the sour reek of sweat baked into walls that were never washed. Chroniclers like Ambroise Paré, the French surgeon of the 16th century, wrote of wounds inflicted by instruments that left flesh burned and split. He did not romanticize them, he described the medical consequences: the ruptured sinews, the dislocations, the hemorrhages. These were not metaphors, they were the precise vocabulary of bodies destroyed. The chambers did not vanish with the Renaissance. The Enlightenment would eventually denounce them. But even as philosophers spoke of reason and rights, kings preserved their dark halls. Louis XI of France, the Spider King, was infamous for his use of cages, iron contraptions known as fillets where nobles were confined in darkness so tight they could not move. Records from the time describe men left so long that their bodies fused to the rusted bars, their skin ulcerated, their minds broken. In the Habsburg realms, dungeons beneath Vienna's Hofburg Palace still held captives well into the 17th century. Chains fixed into masonry remain visible today, silent witnesses to nights when no sound was allowed to rise. Municipal archives confirm that expenses were paid for maintenance of these chambers, iron repaired, ropes replaced, wood renewed. It was administration, not myth. The screams may have faded, but the receipts endure. What shocks most is not the brutality itself but the bureaucracy. The torture chambers of Europe were not aberrations. They were budgeted, staffed, and integrated into systems of justice. Executioners were not rogues but officials, often sworn by oath. Instruments were inventoried, chambers were mapped. Each dungeon was a cog in a greater machine, ensuring that crowns and courts faced little opposition. As you stand now in this memory, you recognize that silence was the greatest weapon. Above ground, records speak of confessions, of justice delivered. Below, the truth was agony stripped of voice. The chambers did not exist to kill, that was for the scaffold. They existed to silence, and silence, in the service of kings, was more enduring than blood spilled in the square. You turn, and for a moment you think you hear it, a faint rasp, a breath caught in the corner. It is not imagination, it is the past, still here, waiting in the stones, pressing against your throat as though you too might be asked to confess. You step deeper, and the darkness seems thicker. The chambers you now recall belong to the centuries when torture reached its height, not hidden anomalies, but fixtures of European justice. The 16th and 17th centuries carried the weight of refinement, when instruments grew more elaborate and chambers more carefully constructed. These were the centuries when the scream became method, when silence was preserved not only by stone but by law. Walk first into Spain, where the Inquisition reached its grim maturity. Official records of autos da fe, the great ceremonies where heretics were condemned, often omit the steps that led to the public square. Those steps were here, beneath the ground, where inquisitors oversaw devices crafted to bend both body and spirit. Manuals survive in Latin and Castilian, describing procedures with chilling precision. The rack, the strappado, the water torment, these were catalogued not as barbarities but as instruments of faith. The silence of the chamber was justified by the salvation of the soul. A Jesuit historian, Juan Antonio Llorente, later compiled volumes based on archives of the Holy Office. He described the cords that cut into flesh, the pulleys that dislocated shoulders, the gallons of water forced into mouths until the stomach stretched like leather. Prisoners choked, gurgled, and fainted, only to be revived so that questions could continue. Inquisitors did not consider this cruelty, they considered it mercy. For the victim lived long enough to confess. But the chambers knew otherwise. They carried the weight of every wretch, every strained gasp that could not escape the stone. Across Europe, each kingdom maintained its own variations. In France, la question ordinaire and extraordinaire were formalized under the ancient regime. Records from the parliament detail exactly how many liters of water could be poured, how many turns of the rack could be applied, how many blows of the boot were permitted. Justice was measured in increments of agony. The chambers where this occurred, low ceilings, heavy doors, barred windows, were designed to ensure no cry could rise to the Parisian air. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire's fragmented courts developed their own arsenal. The thumbscrew, small but devastating, crushed fingers until bones splintered. The boot, of iron or wood, shattered legs with wedges hammered between. Municipal records from Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Bamberg list expenditures for maintaining such devices, down to the blacksmith's bill for replacement screws. Archaeological finds confirm the descriptions: iron clamps, wooden frames, steel wedges. These were not myths drawn by frightened peasants. They were tools preserved by civic order. You pause to imagine the chambers during use. The torchlight flickers, illuminating faces pale with exhaustion. The smell is dense, human sweat mingled with smoke from pitch torches. The copper tang of blood. The executioner, often hooded, moves with routine, tightening straps, adjusting pulleys. He is not an outlaw. He is an employee of the crown, paid and recorded in payrolls that still survive. The inquisitor or judge sits nearby, quill in hand, noting every word, every denial, every groan transformed into testimony. The chamber does not roar. It remains confined, its silence broken only by the muffled sounds of work. Even in England, where torture was officially against common law, the Crown reserved the right to bypass restriction. Elizabeth I authorized its use in cases of treason. The Tower of London's dungeons thus remained active. The rack and the manacles hung in readiness. And when suspicion of Catholic plots arose, bodies were suspended until their joints gave way. Sir Walter Raleigh himself, imprisoned in the Tower, wrote of hearing the cries of others beneath the stone. Though spared the rack, he walked corridors where the silence itself was heavy with memory. What must it have been like to descend those steps, knowing the Crown sanctioned every moment? You feel the stone grow colder beneath your hand as you imagine it. Prisoners shackled, stripped, and bound. The interrogations beginning with simple questions before iron was applied. There is no room for bargaining. The chamber itself guarantees that whatever emerges from lips will be shaped by pain. And outside, the world remains quiet. The cries never breach the ground. The devices themselves became infamous. their names etched into history like shadows burned onto a wall. The rack, the strappado, the thumbscrew, the iron boot, the heretic's fork, the Spanish chair, the scold's bridle, each one designed not to kill but to prolong. The purpose was endurance, not a single scream, but a drawn-out unraveling of resistance. Chroniclers like Johann Weyer, the 16th century physician, described them with clinical horror, noting how veins burst, muscles tore, and joints collapsed. He condemned them, but his descriptions remain proof of their existence. Move further into the 17th century, and you find that secrecy became more essential than ever. Monarchs presented themselves as enlightened rulers, patrons of art and science. Yet beneath their palaces the chambers still whispered. In Vienna, the Hofburg dungeons remained functional. In Prague, municipal records show prisoners chained in the old town hall, even as philosophers like Montesquieu and Beccaria denounced torture. Kings preserved their silence. They claimed it was no longer practiced, while executioners sharpened their instruments in rooms unseen. The silence was not only physical, it was political. To acknowledge torture was to admit tyranny. So rulers denied it, even as expenses were recorded, as blacksmiths forged new manacles, as ropes were replaced. The chambers themselves remained unchanged, thick doors, barred ventilation, torch brackets still darkened by soot. You walk now through one of them in memory, and you can almost hear the echo of footsteps that were not meant to return. And then there are the accounts of survivors, rare but undeniable. In Italy, Galileo Galilei stood before inquisitors in 1633. Though threatened with the strappado, he was spared its full weight. Yet the device stood beside him, chains dangling, ready to wrench his shoulders apart had he not recanted. The chamber shaped his words as surely as any argument. His forced recantation, e pur si muove, became legend, but the chamber beneath shaped the silence of science for centuries. You see how the chambers were not merely tools of punishment. They were instruments of control over thought, belief, and voice. The screams did not need to be heard by the crowd. It was enough that rumor spread, that people whispered of what happened below. The silence itself became weaponized. If no sound emerged, then imagination filled the void, and imagination often created terror greater than any spectacle. In France, accounts from the Bastille confirm that prisoners vanished for years, confined in cells whose darkness itself was torment. Iron collars were fixed to walls, chains so heavy they prevented even lying down. Some prisoners died nameless, their records lost except for a line in an expense ledger for burial. The silence of their chambers consumed not only their voices but their identities. As you stand now in the damp memory of these places, you realize how carefully silence was constructed. It was not an accident. Chambers were designed to be soundproof, to prevent cries from leaking into the world. Guard rotations ensured secrecy. Executioners were sworn to silence. Under penalty of death, scribes recorded confessions, but never the agony that produced them. Silence was policy, as essential as crown or creed. And yet, centuries later, archaeologists uncover the truth. Rusted irons, scorched timbers, shackles embedded in walls. Visitors to castles across Europe can still see them, displayed behind glass. Guides speak softly, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of discomfort. You feel again the weight of those chambers, darkness thick, silence absolute. They no longer echo with screams, but they do not rest either. For centuries, rulers silenced the chambers, but the stone remembers, and so do you. You walk onward, and the air changes. These next chambers belong not to medieval secrecy alone, but to the age when power and paranoia sharpened cruelty into spectacle, yet still hidden beneath palace floors. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe stood at a crossroads. Enlightenment ideals spoke of reason, rights, and humanity, but behind the polished courts of kings, the chambers had not yet gone dark. The irony strikes you as you recall it. Philosophers in Paris debated liberty, while only streets away, men and women were shackled in the conciergerie. In Vienna, salons filled with music by Haydn and Mozart, while below the Hofburg dungeons, chains cut into flesh. London boasted of law and parliament, while the Tower of London still carried its silent implements. The age of reason lived above, the age of torment lived below. Consider France in the late 17th century. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled from Versailles in grandeur unmatched. His court radiated gold, marble, and music, yet beneath his reign torture remained sanctioned. Judicial records from Paris show the use of la question extraordinaire well into his rule. Water forced down throats, limbs stretched on the rack. These were not medieval myths, but daily instruments of justice. The Bastille, symbol of royal authority, carried chains, collars, and underground cells where silence grew heavier with each passing year. Move eastward to the Habsburg lands. In Vienna, the Hofburg subterranean vaults were used to confine and interrogate those accused of treason or heresy. Municipal archives detail the upkeep of these dungeons, repairs to manacles, wages for keepers, payments for wood and iron. Each entry in the ledger is a whisper of agony hidden from the world. The records are bureaucratic, almost casual, but every line confirms that screams once lived here. England, too, held its contradictions, while philosophers like John Locke wrote of natural rights. The Stuart and Tudor monarchs had already established the precedent of sanctioned torture. Even in the early 17th century, the rack still saw use. The gunpowder plot of 1605 ended with Guy Fawkes stretched until his joints broke. His signature on his confession trembling, nearly illegible, as proof of the agony behind it. His trial was public, his torment was not. The chamber that broke him remains in memory, though the wooden frame itself decayed long ago. The chambers also reflected the anxieties of religion. In Spain, the Inquisition endured into the 18th century. Llorente's compilations describe the persistence of devices long after Europe's thinkers had denounced them. Victims were strapped to the potro, suspended in the strappado, forced to endure suffocating water torture. Records note the expenses of ropes, pulleys, and candles. Faith may have cloaked the justification, but the iron was real, and the silence absolute. What you remember most is not the devices themselves, but the atmosphere. Imagine a chamber beneath a palace in Madrid, the ceiling low, the floor damp, torches sputtering in iron brackets. A prisoner hangs suspended, wrists bound behind the back, body swaying with each drop of the pulley. The inquisitor's quill scratches as questions are repeated. The executioner adjusts the rope. Indifferent. Outside, the city is silent, unaware of the shoulder sockets tearing inside. That silence is not ignorance. It is policy. In France, accounts survive of nobles confined in fillets, iron cages ordered by Louis XI. Men reduced to immobility, trapped for months until skin ulcerated, voices weakened, and minds broke. Chroniclers described prisoners emerging bent, unable to stand, eyes wide as though daylight itself had become a torture. Their confinement was never meant to be seen. Silence consumed them before death claimed their remains. Even in Russia, under Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, the Oprichnina maintained chambers of cruelty. Contemporary chronicles recount how nobles accused of treason were dragged into cellars, where hot irons and spikes were applied, tongues cut, bodies dismembered. While much of Russia's torment was public, chambers beneath the Kremlin whispered the same logic: authority secured not only by execution, but by secret silence that prevented resistance from even forming. You pause at the thought of resistance. Few could emerge from these rooms whole. Some survived, but their bodies carried the marks forever. Testimonies, like that of John Gerard or Galileo, remain rare. More often, silence prevailed, not because voices were unwilling, but because voices were destroyed. You realize now the chamber's greatest victory was not over flesh, but over history itself. What remains today are fragments, ledgers, manuals, scars. The screams themselves are gone. Still, physical remnants bear witness. In castles across Europe, tourists now walk through stone corridors where iron rings still protrude from walls. In Nuremberg's dungeons, drainage channels remain etched into the floor. In Carcassonne, hooks fixed to ceilings still mark where ropes once hoisted bodies. In the Tower of London, the Little Ease remains preserved, a space so cramped it requires no imagination to feel its torment. The stone remembers what words rarely do. As you move deeper into memory, the paradox sharpens. By the 18th century, intellectuals wrote tracts against torture. Cesare Beccaria, in his 1764 On Crimes and Punishments, argued that torture was useless and unjust. Montesquieu had already condemned its cruelty. Voltaire mocked its barbarity. And yet, chambers still swallowed voices. France would not formally abolish torture until 1780. Spain's Inquisition persisted into the early 19th century. Silence outlived philosophy by decades. Even abolition did not free the chambers. They were repurposed, renamed, sometimes forgotten. But the architecture remained. The walls that had absorbed centuries of screams did not crumble overnight. Some chambers became storage rooms, others prisons, others tourist curiosities. But to stand inside them, even now, is to feel a pressure that reason cannot erase. You sense it in your chest, as though sound itself refuses to rest. And so you realize that silence is not absence. Silence is presence turned inward. Every chamber you recall is filled with what is no longer heard. The torch smoke, the sweat, the iron, those vanish. But silence remains. It clings heavier than smell, darker than shadow. You take another step, and you imagine the final hours of a victim. Bound, broken, perhaps aware that the scaffold awaited above. Perhaps not. The chamber would not tell. It never promised truth. It promised only that the crown, the court, the creed, would prevail. The chamber's silence was not neutral. It was loyal. Loyal to power. Loyal to fear. Loyal to centuries of authority that required voices erased. And now, centuries later, you are here, listening to what the stone still holds. The chambers do not end when the Enlightenment declares them obsolete. You step forward, and the darkness persists, because authority is reluctant to surrender its most effective silence. The 18th and 19th centuries mark a transformation, not the disappearance of torture chambers, but their evolution, their denial, their burial beneath layers of official language. They did not vanish overnight. They lingered like embers, smoldering in corners of palaces and prisons long after their flames were supposedly extinguished. France provides one of the clearest examples. The official abolition of judicial torture in 1780 did not mean the immediate closure of chambers. Prisoners still endured conditions that mirrored torment, confined in cells so dark and cramped that minds disintegrated. The Bastille fell in 1789. And crowds discovered within its walls not only documents but implements, chains, collars, and cages that testified to the silence long preserved there. Chroniclers record the astonishment of Parisians who, though long aware of rumor, finally stood face to face with the iron that had consumed their neighbors. The chambers had been denied, but denial collapsed when stone and metal spoke more loudly than words. Elsewhere in Europe, the slow march of reform left shadows intact. In Spain, the Inquisition persisted until 1834. Llorente's volumes, published decades earlier, revealed details of chambers where confessions had been manufactured by agony. His descriptions, of cords biting into wrists, of water forced into lungs, were not welcomed by authorities. But they could not be erased. By the time the Holy Office was abolished, the memory of its silence was already etched into history. Chambers once hidden now stood as evidence, their silence broken by ink. Austria and the Habsburg lands also carried remnants into the 19th century. The Hofburg's dungeons fell out of use as formal instruments, yet remained standing, their iron rings untouched, their chains still embedded in masonry. Visitors in later centuries wrote of the oppressive weight of those spaces. How even without prisoners they exuded despair. Such impressions remind you that silence lingers. Even when function ceases, the chamber does not need a voice to remain heavy. The walls themselves breathe the past. England, though earlier in abandoning judicial torture, retained the memory in its architecture. The Tower of London, by the 19th century, had become less a site of torment and more a monument. Yet its spaces, the Little Ease, the rack chamber, still drew attention. Guides led visitors through, pointing to stains on stone and shackles left in place. The silence became a form of spectacle, curated for those who wished to sense history's weight. What had once been hidden was now displayed, but the atmosphere was unchanged. You walk through such a space and feel the same compression in your chest, the same resistance in your breath, as though centuries of cries remained suspended in the air. The 19th century also saw chambers repurposed. Some became prisons for common criminals, where overcrowding and filth replicated the suffering once intentionally inflicted. In others, silence endured not by design but by neglect. Cells with no ventilation, no light, no bedding. Conditions so severe that prisoners lost their senses, echoed the same philosophy of erasure. Officially, torture was abolished. Unofficially, silence remained a weapon. Travel eastward and you find the persistence even stronger. In Russia, the dungeons beneath the Kremlin and the Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg carried prisoners well into the imperial era. Accounts describe noblemen, dissidents, and revolutionaries confined in conditions that recalled medieval cruelty, cold, damp, silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing. These were not called torture chambers, but the effect was identical. The walls erased voice, and the silence served authority. You notice the paradox of progress. The same age that celebrated human rights and liberty also preserved places designed to erase humanity. It was not hypocrisy alone, it was continuity. Rulers understood that silence was as effective as spectacle. Public executions could be seen, debated, even protested. Secret torment left no trace. And so the chambers remained, not loudly, but quietly, woven into the fabric of states unwilling to surrender control. What of memory? The 19th century also birthed a fascination with ruins, with the Gothic, with the macabre. Tourists sought out dungeons. Guides retold stories of racks and manacles. The silence became commercial, a spectacle in itself. Writers like Victor Hugo evoked the horror of confinement in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The imagination feasted on what silence once held, transforming torment into literature. Yet beneath the romantic gaze, the chambers still carried their original weight. You stand inside them, and no embellishment is needed. The air is heavy enough. In some places, chambers were deliberately erased. Floors were bricked over, doors sealed, instruments destroyed. Authorities preferred forgetting, but archaeology does not forget. Excavations in castles from Germany to Italy uncover iron collars, rusted screws, wooden beams marked by strain. Even in ruins, the silence of the chamber endures, forcing recognition. The past resists burial, whispering through each artifact unearthed. By the late 19th century, Europe had largely relegated its torture chambers to memory. Yet the silence they embodied did not vanish. It carried forward, adapted by regimes of the 20th century. The Nazi Gestapo cells in Berlin, the Soviet interrogation rooms in Moscow, the basement prisons across occupied Europe, all inherited the same logic: silence as authority. Though no longer called royal torture chambers, they followed the same pattern: thick walls, low light, cries consumed before they could reach the air above. The lineage is unbroken, though the language changed. You realize now that the chambers are not simply relics. They are archetypes. Each palace dungeon, each inquisitorial vault, each fortress cellar taught the same lesson. Authority thrives when opposition is silenced. Not only publicly but privately, invisibly. Silence was the most loyal servant of kings, emperors, inquisitors, dictators, and silence, once constructed, does not decay. Step again into the chamber. It is empty now. The rack is gone, the manacles removed, the torch brackets rusting, but the air still presses against your throat. The silence is thicker than shadow. You cannot speak here without feeling as though your voice is swallowed. That is the true legacy, not the instruments, not the decrees, not even the names of victims lost, but the silence itself. Waiting, unbroken, and as you stand, you begin to understand why these places still hold power. They remind us that beneath crowns and courts, beneath declarations of rights and justice, there always existed rooms where voices vanished. The chambers may be closed, but their silence has never ended. The chambers now take on sharper detail in your memory. You begin to see not only the walls in iron but the faces of those who endured them. Their names survive, scattered through chronicles and trial records. Each one confirms that the silence of these places was not an invention, it was lived, documented, and sealed in blood and ink. In England, you recall the case of Anne Askew, a Protestant woman interrogated under Henry VIII and later under his son Edward VI. She was accused of heresy and brought to the Tower of London in 1546. The rack awaited her, its wooden frame already groaning with age. Records from her own testimony survive. Preserved before her death, she wrote that her body was so torn by the rack that she could no longer walk. She was carried to her execution on a chair. Her screams did not echo into the city, they dissolved into the stone. What the crowd saw on the scaffold was not a woman weakened by faith alone, but one broken by iron long before flames consumed her. The chamber preserved its silence, while the truth of her torment reached posterity only through her words. Another figure stands before you, Edmund Campion, the Jesuit priest captured under Elizabeth I in 1581. He was confined to the tower, where the rack was applied repeatedly. Witnesses recorded how his limbs were stretched, his body disjointed, until he could scarcely move. Yet when brought to trial, he still spoke with clarity, denying guilt. The silence of the chamber could not entirely extinguish his voice, though it marked his body forever. His execution came swiftly afterward, but the deeper execution had already occurred beneath the stone vaults. Nearby, another device unique to England takes shape in your vision, the scavenger's daughter. Unlike the rack, which stretched the body, this iron frame compressed it. Invented during the reign of Henry VIII, it forced the victim into a crouched position, binding knees to chest, head to legs, until circulation choked and breath came shallow. Blood vessels burst, muscles cramped, ribs pressed inward. Chroniclers describe how victims emerged from the device streaming blood from nose and ears. The chamber required no roar of pain. The silence was thick with the sound of breath breaking into gasps. The tower also housed the practice of pressing, known as peine forte et dure. Prisoners who refused to plead in court were laid flat and slowly crushed by weights placed upon their chest. Records confirm that Margaret Clitheroe, a Catholic woman in York, suffered this fate in 1586. Later, in Salem, across the ocean, Giles Corey endured the same pressing until his chest collapsed. Though his case belongs to colonial America, its origins were English, sanctioned by law, preserved in silence. The chamber, whether in a castle or a jail, swallowed the cries until only weight remained. Across the channel, other instruments claimed their victims. In France, judicial torture remained systematized, its details preserved in the Parliament's registers. Water poured down throats until stomachs stretched. Boots crushed shins with wedges hammered between. Racks drew confessions letter by letter. The silence was official, sanctioned, justified as procedure. The chambers beneath Paris still held the implements long after philosophers above debated liberty. The irony lingers with you as you imagine it, Enlightenment salons glowing with candlelight, while underground cells echoed with muffled wretches. Germany's free cities, too, preserved their chambers. In Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Bamberg, the thumbscrew reduced fingers to splinters. The Spanish boot, though German in use, shattered bones with wedges until marrow seeped. Municipal ledgers record the blacksmith's fees for repairs. Such documents are mundane, but their banality is proof. Pain was not extraordinary, it was accounted like rope or firewood. The chambers absorbed the routine, their silence punctuated by the thud of wedges, the creak of screws. And then there are the oubliettes, the bottle dungeons, found in castles such as Warwick in England or Chillon in Switzerland. These were vertical shafts where prisoners were lowered, sometimes for weeks, sometimes until death, narrow, damp, with no bedding, no light, no air beyond what seeped through cracks. They erased not only voice but existence. Chronicles mention them sparingly, often as curiosities, but archaeological surveys confirm their shape: deep, narrow, impossible to climb. Silence was absolute. Victims vanished, not through execution, but through forgetting. The chamber's silence became its very name: oubliette, a place of forgetting. The medical aftermath of these torments was recorded by physicians like Ambroise Paré, surgeon to French kings in the 16th century. He wrote of dislocated shoulders, torn ligaments, crushed bones, hemorrhages that left victims near death. His descriptions are clinical, detached, but they testify to what the chambers inflicted. Disfigurement was not rare, it was expected. Victims left chambers unable to walk, unable to hold quill or spoon, unable to live without pain. Their voices may have been silenced, but their bodies carried echoes that no silence could conceal. Even Galileo, though spared full torture, stood in 1633 before the device. The strappado dangled nearby as inquisitors threatened him with its use. His shoulders were not torn from sockets, but the presence of the chamber shaped his words. His recantation was delivered not to the world, but to the silence pressing upon him from the ropes and pulleys. Science itself bent beneath the weight of chambers that never allowed truth to emerge uncoerced. By the 17th century, the chambers were already objects of debate. Voices like Beccaria condemned them. Montesquieu argued against their use. Voltaire ridiculed their cruelty. Yet even as philosophy denounced them, practice continued. The chambers did not close at the stroke of a pen. They lingered, swallowing voices, even as books above ground declared their end. What strikes you most is how the chambers combined extremes. Some inflicted fire and iron. Others inflicted silence and darkness. Some crushed bones. Others crushed time. Some forced voices to confess. Others forced voices to vanish. But all shared one purpose: to erase resistance before it could rise into air. Imagine now the sensory weight. In the tower's little ease, joints throbbed with cramps. In the Bastille's cells, damp walls smelled of mold and rot. In the oubliettes, silence was broken only by dripping water. In chambers with the rack, the sound of sinew tearing carried louder than cries. And in pressing cells, the faint rattle of stone weights marked each breath closer to collapse. These are not inventions, they are recorded, witnessed, preserved. Each sensation belongs to someone once confined here. Each chamber still remembers. You stand among them, centuries later. The racks are displayed in museums. The cages rust in castle tours. The oubliettes gape open beneath tourist feet. But the silence remains the same. Guides speak, crowds murmur, yet when the group moves on, the chamber returns to stillness. It is a silence heavier than noise. Because it is not emptiness, it is memory. And so you realize that what endures is not the iron, not even the names of kings who ordered these torments, but the silence itself. It is the silence of centuries, thick and unbroken, where screams once lived and were swallowed whole. You cannot leave without carrying that silence with you. You stand at the threshold of the final chambers, and now you begin to see how their silence did not end with monarchs. The legacy continued, reshaped, hidden beneath new names. What had once been royal dungeons became prisons, secret police cells, interrogation rooms. The pattern remained unchanged: thick walls, absence of light, cries smothered before they could escape. The 19th century saw revolutions sweep across Europe. Thrones fell, constitutions rose, but the chambers remained. In Vienna, the Hofburg cells were repurposed, but prisoners still reported confinement so harsh it broke minds. In France, after the revolution, torture was declared abolished, yet prisons like La Conciergerie and later mazes held inmates in conditions scarcely different. Silence endured not because of law, but because of architecture. The chambers did not need sanction, they only needed to remain standing. Consider the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. Built under Peter the Great and expanded by his successors, it became the empire's silent maw. Decembrist rebels of 1825 were confined within its Trubetskoy bastion. Diaries and testimonies survive, describing narrow cells where cold seeped through stone, where silence pressed so heavily that thought itself seemed to fade. The prisoners endured not iron racks or boots, but a stillness that gnawed at sanity. Their words record it plainly. The silence itself was the torment. In Berlin, by the 19th century, the prisons of Prussia carried forward the same tradition. The cells of Spandau and Moabit, though officially modern, relied on isolation and silence as instruments of control. Prisoners reported pacing endlessly, their steps the only sound in chambers that seemed to swallow echoes. Silence had become refined, transformed into solitary confinement, but its purpose remained the same: to erase voice, to extinguish resistance in quiet. And then the 20th century arrived, and with it, silence deepened into horror. The Nazi regime adapted old traditions into its Gestapo prisons. In the cells of Prinz Albrecht Strasse in Berlin, cries were contained within basements where thick doors sealed sound. Survivors wrote after the war of rooms where water torture, beatings, and suspensions by wrists were practiced. The official record spoke of interrogation. The chambers themselves whispered otherwise. Orador, Ravensbrück, Dachau, each bore witness to silence shaped into industrial scale. While the death camps embodied public murder, the interrogation cells remained heirs of medieval chambers. Ropes, whips, boots, chains, devices already centuries old, were applied with new efficiency. Testimonies after 1945 confirm it. Victims described the same sensations noted by Ambroise Paré, the same dislocations suffered by John Girard, the same suffocations recorded by Llorente. The lineage was unbroken. In Soviet Russia, the NKVD maintained interrogation rooms across the empire. The Lubyanka in Moscow became infamous. Survivors recall being led down steps into chambers where silence ruled, where thick doors sealed cries, where confessions were written before questions were asked. Torture was not named, it was denied. But the rooms, the methods, sleep deprivation, beatings, the strappado reborn as conveyor interrogation, were direct descendants of royal dungeons. Silence was their greatest ally. As you recall these later centuries, the chambers seem less medieval curiosities and more eternal blueprints. Each regime, whether monarchy, revolution, fascism, or communism, preserved the same architecture. The walls thickened, the doors sealed, the cries erased. What mattered was never the device itself, it was the guarantee that no sound reached the world outside. Silence remained the constant. Step back further in thought. Consider how tourists now wander these places. Their voices hushed. In the Tower of London, guides speak of the rack with clinical detachment. In Carcassonne, the oubliette is pointed out like a relic. In Vienna, the Hofburg's dungeons are walked in silence. Even in Russia, the Peter and Paul fortress is preserved as a museum. But none of these spaces have lost their weight. Step into them, and you feel your breath catch. The silence presses as though centuries of cries linger. Too heavy to lift. The paradox is clear. The chambers were designed to erase voices. Yet they remain the most eloquent witnesses of history. They speak not through sound but through absence. Each rusted chain, each iron ring, each blackened torch bracket tells a story louder than screams. The silence itself testifies. And here, in the last of these remembered chambers, you understand the meaning of their endurance. They reveal the fragility of power. Crowns crack, empires fall, ideologies collapse, but silence remains. Rulers trusted it more than armies. They trusted stone more than ink. They trusted silence more than truth. And in doing so, they built chambers that still stand. Waiting, centuries later, you reach out, place your hand against the wall. It is cold, damp, rough with age, yet beneath your palm you feel the weight of thousands who touched it before you, prisoners bracing themselves as iron tightened. Inquisitors steadying torches, jailers fastening locks. Their voices are gone, but the stone remembers. It remembers not with sound, but with silence. And so you leave the chamber knowing this: silence was never absence. It was presence, compressed, forced inward until it filled the stone. The chambers may stand empty, their instruments removed, but silence itself has not ended. It clings, heavy, eternal, waiting for those who dare to remember. You climb back toward the surface, and the air changes. The damp chill of the chambers gives way to the breath of daylight. But the silence clings to you, heavy as chains. You realize that you are no longer only a witness to walls and iron. You are a carrier of their memory. History records kings, decrees, battles, crowns, but beneath every palace, beneath every court, silence carried equal weight. The chambers remind you that power is never only gold and marble, it is also darkness and stone. It is not only parades of soldiers, it is also the quiet of prisoners who will never speak again. You recall their names, scattered like fragments: Anne Askew, John Gerard, Edmund Campion, Galileo, nameless thousands pressed into oubliettes, forgotten in Bastille cells, swallowed by Inquisition vaults. Their words survive in fragments, their cries erased, but the chambers remain, bearing witness through iron rings still fixed in stone, through ledgers that recorded rope and manacle as casually as firewood. Silence has a memory stronger than sound. And what is the lesson? That power trusted silence more than justice. That crowns, emperors, inquisitors, and dictators all believed the absence of voice was stronger than truth. Yet silence did not triumph. We stand here centuries later, and the chambers still speak, not through screams, but through the weight of their stillness. The past is not erased. It waits in stone, in iron, in the air that still tastes of smoke and sweat. Step into any preserved dungeon in London, in Paris, in Vienna, and you will feel it. The hush of the group around you, the lowering of voices, the hesitation before touching walls. It is not imagination, it is recognition. We know, even without words, what these chambers contain. They contain centuries of erased voices, waiting to be remembered, and perhaps that is why they matter. Because silence, when remembered, ceases to serve power, it begins to serve memory. The chambers that once erased resistance now resist forgetting. Each iron collar displayed in a museum, each dungeon open to visitors, each ledger studied by historians transforms silence into testimony. And you, standing here, are part of that transformation. You pause one last time and see it clearly. A rusted manacle embedded in stone. A name scratched into a wall. A floor scored by shackles dragged across it. These are not ruins. They are reminders. Reminders that power is fragile. That silence is not eternal. That time unravels even the thickest stone. And so you leave, carrying with you not screams, not cries, but silence itself. The silence that once served to erase, now serving to remind. The past is not dead. It is only waiting.